Good evening, and welcome to the Art Institute of Chicago. I'm Michelle Holland, Vice President of the Society for Contemporary Art, your host of tonight's program. We hope that by coming to programs like this one, you will connect with artists, curators, educators, collectors, dealers, and other like-minded, art-engaged people like yourself in ways that will expand your mind. Established in 1940 as a not-for-profit organization, the SCA supports the museum by engaging the community in a dialogue about the art of our time. We focus on two main pursuits: providing programs, many of them free and open to the public, like this one, throughout the fall and the spring of each year, and acquiring works for the museum's permanent collection. As many of you well know, the Society of Contemporary Art is a membership-supported organization open to everyone with a range of membership supporting opportunities, including artist, junior, friend, sponsor, patron, and benefactor memberships, all available on our website. We sincerely hope that if you are not already a member, you will join the Society for Contemporary Art and come to events like this one and support our efforts. Before we begin tonight's program with our guest and artist speaker, Tishan Hsu, I would like to briefly highlight a few upcoming SCA events. On Thursday, November 14, SCA members will enjoy a tour of Torkazi Dyson of Line and Memory, the first major solo exhibition with the artist at Gray Gallery. Very exciting. The SCA acquired a painting by this artist and gifted it to the museum in 2021 as part of our annual acquisition program. And looking ahead, on Wednesday, January 22nd of 2025, Judith Geishman, Chicago-based painter and professor, will deliver a lecture here in Fullerton Hall, which will be free and open to the public. Now, I would like to invite SCA Director Yi Chao to introduce our special guest.
Thank you, Michelle, and welcome everyone. I'm Yi Chao, Director of the Society for Contemporary Art, and it's my great pleasure to welcome the incredibly visionary artist Tishan to this evening's talk. And I have long admired how Tishan explores the profound cognitive and physical effects of technological advancements on the human body. Since the mid-1980s, Tishan has been using unconventional materials, digital tools, and innovative fabrication techniques to create paintings and sculptures that reimagine the body's relationship with technology. His pioneering work blends digital aesthetics with deeply organic human forms, offering a thought-provoking commentary on our increasingly mediated existence. Tishan's work has been exhibited globally in the US, Mexico, Europe, and Asia, and is part of numerous prominent public and private collections. You may know him from the acclaimed Liquid Circuit exhibition at the Hammer Museum in LA and the SculptureCenter in New York in 2020. He has also participated in major international exhibitions, including the Venice Biennale, Gwangju Biennale, and the Carnegie International, among others. In recent years, Tishan has been part of standout exhibitions at the KW Institute in Berlin, Museion in Italy, and most recently, a European survey at MAMCO in Geneva and an impressive show at Secession in Vienna. Tonight, we get to hear directly from Tishan himself about his creative process, what drives his work, and how he sees the world. And I can't think of a better guide for exploring the fascinating intersections of art, technology, and the human experience. Welcome, Tishan, and thank you for sharing your insights with us this evening.
Thank you, E, and thank you for Society of Contemporary Art for inviting me here to speak today. Just to introduce this talk, the way I speak now is not how I was able to articulate my work in the whole process from the beginning. It's only now in retrospect that I'm able to articulate what actually went on. So in terms of just the process itself, it was much more intuitive and with much more tentative sense of what I was doing. So I briefly will just say I was born in Boston, and my first sort of serious interest in art was in Madison, Wisconsin, where my father was professor at the university there. And my mother enrolled me with a private teacher who was an American realist who studied under George Bellows. So I got a very rigorous kind of painting background. And then we moved to Virginia, and there I studied with an artist who worked from the French Impressionist tradition. So this is to say that I really, before I even went to college, my background just by chance happened to be in painting. So even though the work I'm doing is really not centrally about painting, it definitely kind of influenced how I handled materials and how I was thinking about what I wanted to do. That's not to privilege painting or to say I'm a big advocate of painting, but just to give a sense that this was just happened to be where I came from. So in the time that we have here, I'm going to give you a sense of how it all began in the work and the basic ideas that I was thinking about to generate the work. And then I'll go briefly through some of the different, the evolution of the work, and then talk about some broader issues that now I can see in the work that I could not during the whole process. Okay, so I really thought not to be an artist when I was starting out. And I trained in architecture, and it's not that I had anything against art, it's just I didn't think I had the temperament. And it was really when I realized that I didn't have a choice, that there was a certain sense of necessity, that I decided I had to really just go for it. And I often thought, I looked to other artists and people who talked about their lives as artists, and I think of the quote, or the story of André Gide, the writer, who was teaching at, here in the States at a class, and the students asked him, what do you need to be a writer? And he says, if you can do anything else, you should go do it. And then if you can't do anything, then you might be a writer. So that's kind of the headspace that I was in. And so I had to think of, so what do I want to do with the work? And if I was going to devote my life to the work, I immediately assumed that there would be no commercial success, and that I needed to be able to accept that and be able to work with that in order for this to work at all. So I needed something that would really sustain my curiosity for my whole life. So I was thinking of a question that to me was, had enough what I felt was unknown that I could really keep going with it. And so one of the big things that I felt was going on was this emergence of technology in the culture. And that was one reason why I went to the school that I did at MIT, was really because I wanted to be immersed in what I could see was this technological framework or sort of mindset. Even though I was not technological, I was not a nerd, I was not an engineer. In fact, I got in because it was the class where they were trying to lower the sort of math and tech standards to sort of broaden the class. So, but I was interested in technology and how it felt, and sort of what the ambiance or the affect of that was. So I considered working in filmmaking. In fact, I thought filmmaking would be the medium of the future. And I realized at that time, independent filmmaking, it may take several years to be able to make your film, to raise the money to do independent film, and I didn't have the patience for that. So I was sort of resigned to working with what I knew, which was painting and sculpture and something more traditional. And so with that, I moved to New York and began the work. So here, this piece, is this on full screen here? Let me just see. Yeah, okay. So this I actually did right out of grad school. I was taking a year off just to make the decision, and I wouldn't allow myself to do anything but art. So if I got bored, that was too bad. I couldn't just, start reading or doing other activities. I wanted to see whether I really had the focus enough to keep just going into the studio every day in a very repetitive, way. So this piece came out at the end of the year when I decided I did not have it to be an artist. But the one piece that came out was this. It was on wood, and these are photographs. This is not metal, And you can see I took photographs. There's a body, and there's this hint of the TV screen, and then this grid. And I show this work. It isn't quite finished, but it has the components of what my work really has always had in the work, which is this somehow attempt to integrate the body with a kind of technological media, but yet in a physical object. This is like a step. It's maybe 4 or 5 feet high. And so this paradox of illusion and physicality was there in the beginning. So, and I'm going to be jumping around a little bit just in terms of what I say. I don't have a planned out slide presentation here. So, when I went to New York, I got a job as a word processor. And it was in a law firm on Wall Street. And it paid well. At the time, word processing was very new for law. And they paid well because no one could do it. And the secretaries were really somewhat rebellious and felt it was going to take their jobs. So they just hired anybody. And there was a huge sort of freelance network that you could get a freelance job, a temp job, that's what I'm trying to say. So that position put me in front of a screen. And this is the beginning of the word processor, where they were using a screen, and the word processing was reacting to you. So it was not like television. And that interaction was really amazing to me because I thought I would be just bored stiff with this job. And that I would just get into this interaction with the text, and the text would then finish my sentences, and it just became kind of meditative. So somehow I felt this was, in some ways, a paradigm for what was happening. I could see in the law firm. And there were lawyers who refused to even read printouts. They wanted the secretaries to take all the paper off, rip up the paper in individual pieces of paper, and put it on their desk like the old paper. And the idea of a computer on their desk was absolutely not even imagined at that point. So that position of just the screen and my body were the two things to me that was going on. So that I wanted to take and somehow try to, or that was what was motivating the work. So the question of how to integrate the body into this object and this dual experience. So I looked to sort of where in art I could do that, and I didn't really see that. If I could, that would have been much easier. So in terms of the body, there was the Western figure ground, where you have foreground, background, or there's abstraction, where the body sort of disappears into the material, into the paint. And then that was kind of the paradigm for how we deal with the body. So it seemed to me that this was going to be a different way our bodies were going to be in the world. And that perhaps we didn't have a way yet of visualizing it. And so that to me was very interesting and very challenging. And that the body, what was counterintuitive was this was going to be a world that is of illusion now. And I thought it just didn't quite make sense to me, because from modernism, everything was about being very concrete, being about physicality, being about science and molecules, and we understood everything. And so we have objects, like as in minimalism. And suddenly I was saying, wait a minute, I'm saying the world's going to become more like an illusion now. And so I started looking at very traditional Western depictions of illusion, as in trompe-l'oeil, or like in Renaissance painting. And I realized, going back into history, that also was a world of illusion. So I thought this is really interesting that we're going to go back into an illusionary world here, but in a very different format. So the whole effort here was to create this paradox of an illusion, at the same time acknowledging that it's an object. So this piece was the very first piece. I thought it was very clumsy. I didn't show it for 35 years until around 2018, because the curators said they wanted to show it. This piece I'm just talking about because it's going to be at the MCA. So this is my first attempt. I felt like I was just kind of jamming the body into some kind of screen. So it seemed very clumsy. But in retrospect, it does show the attempt here of what I was trying to do. The screen part, the media part, was all hand-painted. It was scratched through like oil stick to create the visual quality of media as in a TV screen. And then the rest is very, very physical. It's concrete over styrofoam on wood. So I was going for something very, very physical, almost primitive in its concrete quality. So again, there was this kind of bringing of two opposites together. The sense was that I felt that this beginning of this technology was actually a very primitive beginning of something much larger. So trying to make it feel primitive at the same time that it had this illusionistic media quality. And so with that, I began to figure out how can I begin to develop a syntax for the work that would have this basic paradigm of illusion and physicality. So these works I'm going to just quickly go through are just the early experiments in that. This one, you can see I put the screen and then the image of the work is in the screen. So for me, it's very significant in the evolution because it's becoming self-reflexive now. So it's the machine aware of itself, the media aware of itself. So all of this, as I said in the very beginning, was just very intuitive. I did not have a sense of how something should look. It was really just going by the properties of what I was experiencing. I didn't know what it would look like when I tried to put them together, and then it just came out looking like this. And I just said, okay, this is it. This is it. I couldn't explain it, and I couldn't explain really what the broader ideas were. It just was this basic, it had the basic properties of what I was looking for. Which is why it was difficult when it first emerged in the art world, because people wanted me to explain it, and I really didn't have that much to say. I could just talk like I am now. This is a piece I did. Growing up in the 50s, I was very fascinated with the cars. I was a car fanatic. So I remember the Edsel, which was discontinued, and it had this really weird vertical grille. So here I'm bringing in the iconography of American objects. So this was like the thing, this grill from the Edsel, the Ford Edsel, and then this was an illusionary space of a skin. So I'm trying to combine these things all in one in a visual statement, so to speak. So for me, and this is not to privilege necessarily, again, painting, but I'm very visual. I want to visualize what I was thinking here. And I wanted to visualize to the extent that it did not need my explanation or did not need any text. It needed to be self-evident. And that made it much harder. So here I'm experimenting with just trying to say, can I convey some sense of landscape now with this syntax? So this is my first attempt. This is called terrain. And the reason I'm jumping around, one is with the object, one is with landscape, is I knew if for this thing to work, I wanted to be able to talk about the landscape and talk about consumer objects and talk about the body and talk about technology all together at the same time. So I was sort of just testing whether that could do it in this very primitive way. This is a plug. So I'm taking just the plug and then making it this kind of illusionary space. So it's like the illusion that comes from when we plug in. Okay, this is a close-up just to give you a sense of the quality of the work, because people often tell me they could not imagine it looks the way it does when you actually see the work. So this is this gray concrete. It's maybe 2 to 3 inches above the surface of the board, and all of the green is completely flat. Like you would see, let's say, in old master painting, where it's an illusion, but it's completely flat when you look at it. And I actually did study sort of trompe-l'oeil painting and oil painting. So what's going on here is the illusion is referring to the square, the object. So it's both recognizing that it is just an object on the wall, but at the same time, it's an illusion of the object. And the rounded corners has nothing to do with the media screen. It was really, at the time, just to make sure that it's not a picture frame, that you look into a world that you're imagining, that this was literally in front of you at the same time. I never imagined there would be an iPhone or iPad or the desktop screen at the time. Okay. So then I began to let it evolve. And here I'm still trying now to say, all right, this is now a skin. And that's a very important concept in the work. Coming from architecture, we often talk about the structure, the core, and then you put a skin on it. So all these glass buildings you have here in Chicago, from architectural terms, it's like about a skin going around the structure. So for me, when I looked at this, how should I say it? This illusion that acknowledges the object, it became the skin, and I realized then the topography of the landscape, the topography of our body, our skin, and the TV screen that was rolling when the picture cut out, all had this rolling topological property. And so I pushed that a lot more and see what I could do just keeping within that syntax. The slots came because at the time Citibank was offering the ATM for the first time, and there were these slots you put your card into. And so suddenly that became like a paradigmatic shape for me. And then here, I'm trying to use this syntax to see whether I can also talk about, to move into the political. So part of the interest in the body is I wanted to be able to address the political issues of the body, and that it's the conditions of the body that really create politics. And so this allowed me to know that if this was going to keep evolving, I could then be able to address that as well. Okay, so this here is called Outer Banks of Memory. Memory was as in computer memory. This little square in the middle was a separate piece put on, again, and this is the idea of the machine being conscious of itself. So it's a screen looking into the screen, and then it begins to toy with, are we looking at the screen or is the screen looking at us? This was my first show at Pat Hearn, who was one of the early galleries in the East Village at the time in the early 80s. That was the first show I had in New York. So when I first showed, people asked me whether I was interested in musical instruments. They asked me whether this was about outer space, whether I was interested in science fiction. So for me, it was frustrating because I did not feel it was really communicating what I wanted to talk about. So the next body of work, I began to move into silkscreen to, in a way, become less about the hand, but I did not want to lose the properties of the more traditional materials, and that's why I was working it. So I'm going to jump now. This piece was called... Here, let me see. Oh, sorry, before I move into the silkscreen, so I continued to do sculpture. This piece, I've always been interested in the natural world and the animal world. So even though I focused very much on the body, as in the human body, I wanted to also begin to bring in the natural world as just an extension of the body as well. So here's an experiment, which was this topography again, and just using the cow's skin and the way color manifests in nature. So I was experimenting with, I didn't want to paint the spots on. The spots actually are structural. So it's black concrete and yellow concrete, and I put it together. And it made a difference in terms of how you perceived the surface. Okay, so this is sort of my second show. This was actually from the Hammer show more recently. So one of the things I wanted to do in the sculpture versus in the painting was to really push this idea of this expansive flatness. And for me, it was somewhat of a metaphor of the web itself. At that time, that's how people talked about the internet, is the web. And the sense of this continuous space that would just go on and on. And I was trying to see, how could you visualize that? How could you even express that? This was like virtual. It was invisible. The word virtual really wasn't even used at the time. So this was my first try, and I was using these 2x2 American Olean bathroom tiles. And the reason was I was not trying to refer to, bathrooms or kitchens or whatever, although the association actually added an interesting content to the work. It's really the idea of the grid, and that it had a dual quality, just like I talked about in the screen and the object, in that this was an object, as in Carl Andre's steel pieces. But then as you stood back, it started feeling like a long distance. And that's because of the lines of the grid. And that duality was for me, a kind of a similar metaphor to this duality of the object and then the illusion. If you'll note here that the red reflection, so underneath it's all neon red. I've always wanted in my sculpture to have it float and to be, in a sense, to be contingent. In all of my work, even when I'm installing, in an installation situation, I put them at different heights because I want this sense. It's not like showing my work in a more traditional gallery situation. They could be objects and they could be anywhere. And similarly for the sculpture. So there's a sense of contingency of this so-called object. And then there's this illusionary world that moves everywhere. So here again, I'm going back and forth. You can see I'm trying different things. Here I'm just looking at the idea of the wound, which reappears in my work, and the cut, and the idea that you have this technological surface, you have the skin, but for me, it's really to see blood. The blood really has a lot of other connotations of violence, of war, of wounds, whatever. And that continues to emerge in the work. This is my experiment when they first had the idea of Bluetooth. So they have two objects that are in relation, but they don't touch. And so I thought, let me see if I can try to convey this sense in the work. And what I didn't do then, I have many sketches of works I never executed, never finished, just because of the time and resources. If I had like 4 or 5 of these all floating on the wall, but somehow related, and then I'm looking at the negative space as part of the work. And that becomes another form. People sometimes ask if my architectural training had some influence. One thing about architectural training, in my experience, was it was, about systems, about many things coming together that you have to coordinate, which I feel is what the work is trying to do. But the other thing is I majored in environmental design versus architecture per se of buildings. So environmental design at the time was all the spaces in between, like when you have a city. It's the sidewalk, it's the furniture, it's the sounds, it's the garbage cans, everything that creates really the environment that we walk around in as architecture. So for me, the negative space is very much as much a part of the work on how I think of sculptural form. This piece was called Cell. At the time, I was thinking really of cell as in biology. This is kind of I don't want to say a biotech vision, but the idea of screen and this organic thing. I was not thinking of a cell phone. Okay, so my next body of work was using silkscreen. And so the question always was, if you're doing it with technology, why are you working with your hand? And it was a valid question. Why don't you just, jump into a technological medium, like be a video artist or a filmmaker? And my concern was not being technological, but it's the affect of technology. It's how it is affecting our connection to the technology. What's the technology really feel like? And I think it's so seamless. I mean, now I'm talking in retrospect. I can talk about it like this. I could not talk about it like this when I was doing it. But we can see now that this has happened so seamlessly that we're not even aware of the extent to which this technology has penetrated our lives. And so it's that seamlessness that almost feels like it's all the same. We're still living in the same way in this analog world. For me, it's that difference between the two that I'm interested in. I don't think we are really living in the analog world. I think it's already affecting us, but it's not really fully conscious because it's not a physical, visual change here. We change how we move, how we interact, but it's much more intangible, but no less violent in a way. So here I'm trying to really make it more manufactured, and so I was using silk screen. However, these rippled, for me, was like ripples of fat. I created them with pastel by hand, and I wanted to keep that quality in the silk screen. But the silk screen allowed me to now bring in media images, which was very big in the art world at the time. I mean, this is the whole media picture generation. And it allowed me to bring in actual images of the body. And that really pinned the work. So people had very clearly what I was trying to deal with. The more I moved to the body, the more people drew away from the work. And I thought that was interesting. So the more it became really what I wanted to say, then people really just didn't get it. Where it was more abstract, like in the 80s, people thought it was fine. When in fact, the real content is really what is happening to the body. So here I'm still working with the tiles and trying to use that now with the printed images. This piece called Living Color, I'm just now using just the framing itself. I spent a couple of years in Cologne, and my studio was right next to a window company. And the German windows are just beautifully made. And so I was so inspired by the quality of their windows, I wanted to have them as frames. And so he's willing to make up a few for me. And this piece, so the frame is part of the work. On the right-hand side, there's a little white telephone. And so this, I'm trying to talk about just the, how should I say it, the race of information, so that there are those who get the information and those who don't. And I was able to just take the same images that I used in the earlier piece and just add color and tone. So the way I'm working now is beginning to be more in a manufactured mode to still create the meaning and the content. And so that's what I was exploring. That's actually what I was experimenting with. Could I do that and be convincing? This was a small piece. So when I went to Germany, I had to, just to even be residents for a couple of years, I had to apply for what they call a certificate of good behavior, which I thought was very ironic. And they required these fingerprints. And so I just was inspired to do a piece just about that experience. And this is a wired glass under the same window frame I was talking about, and then the fingerprints underneath that. Okay, so here gives you a little more of the evolution of the sculpture itself, which was another part of the practice. The beginning was, I actually, when I started, I was coming in from architecture, so it was sort of, I came into sculpture first, and here I'm trying to just take the continuous surface of the tile and see whether that could be an aesthetic. And then I took the grout and made this raw concrete, so it begins to have a landscape quality. But it's still an object. So there's a sense of distance, and yet there's a sense of the physical object in front of you. And here, this is called close in. I was inspired by the front end of an automobile, where it's sort of symmetrical, and you have as a compositional framework. And then I'm experimenting with the color of tile. One reason I really like tile is because it came in different colors. For me, color was really important. I needed to have that in whatever I was doing. So these are attempts where I'm it still have to deal with the ground. That's why eventually I made this thing where it just floats, with how to get rid of the support. So conceptually, I'm beginning now. This is called Kitchen Highway. So I use the reference of the kitchen and then the speed and this kind of moving speed, and trying to combine what seemed to be very paradoxical situations and put them together as one. And I think that is also very endemic of what is going on in the world. This piece actually was shown at Rona Hoffman here in Chicago for the first time. And I recently was able to reacquire it, which I'm very happy about. So here I'm using the tile now, and I'm getting more explicitly about the body. And now it's beginning to be, we're in the 1990s, medical technologies, the whole, what was going on in biological and medical research was beginning to, hit the mainstream. So here, this is about flow as an electrical flow. This is about, the image you see is silkscreen on glass, and it's really an incision into a body, and that white dot is a bone. So I'm trying to imagine the body flowing through objects. And so there's these wires that connect the two objects. And then you see the silkscreen print of this pastel I did of the rolling fat. So there's a sense of the embodied objects. And then this is just... you see the little piles of stuff. That's just concrete just dumped onto the glass to try to associate to, like in the lab, just tissue that is beginning now to be the stuff of what we're creating. We're creating sort of new life. I was in Germany, I was missing the US, so I did this very American piece. Here, these were the power windows of an automobile, and then now infused into the body as though you were pushing your body with these power windows in silkscreen. So from the earlier work doing by hand, I did feel that the silkscreen was making the work much more integrated. It became a whole other thing. And it was this merging of somehow something embodied, and yet it was this continuous surface. However, you can see the lines that still make the grid. And I tried to make that grid less and less visible, so it's really continuous. So all of my work I'm doing, it's always an experiment, always an attempt to get further along, which is why I kind of withdrew from showing a lot, because in a show, you sort of have an idea and then you do the whole body of work of a whole show. And that takes a lot of time, and I just felt it was very frustrating because I didn't feel I was ready to do that. I didn't really know what I was doing yet. And I keep seeing the next step, and I just want to go to the next step. So there's always a battle in a way for what's needed for a commercial career and what I was really wanting to do. At the same time, I could feel the more I got with the body and the more sort of like this, the more people just drew away from the work. It seemed sort of horrific in some level, which I could understand. So the way I could create this piece, if you can see it closely, so it's only through pastel that I could use. I used a Xerox copier. I had an image of a finger, and then with pastel, I could create other kinds of skin qualities and then add more fingers, so it became some other kind of thing, other kind of hand-like organ. But at the time, it's only because I could work with pastel, which is very, right from the hand like clay, and then fuse the photography into that. So here, the mouths are from a flounder, a fish, And I mention that only because I mentioned in the Holy Cow piece that this is, again, I'm trying to now bring in the natural world into the human world and make it continuous. At the same time, the whole thing is a technological thing. It's this virtual space. So in retrospect, I think I really want to connect the body, the natural world, to technology to say that's all one thing. It's continuous. And people are not talking about AI, and I feel the same of AI. AI is a product of our species. And I think I would propose that we need to think more really of what's happening as the whole species now, because that is what's happening, and that segues into the whole environmental thing, where now we're identifying with the animals. We're not only worried about ourselves, we're also worried about the whole natural world coming extinct. So that's a shift in how we think about ourselves, where it used to be just so-called man with the natural world, and they're sort of opposed or separate entities. This is a pastel to give you a sense. I still do these kind of works on paper, where I'm still just creating this skin quality, but then it's put in this frame. These are, the window frame, but it's sealed with a rubber gasket, so there's a sense of vacuum. So I'm trying to get an affect of the technology, the airless technology, and the body inserted inside of it. I lost my cursor here. So here I'm using now the black dots of the silk screen over this image. This is of a snake head with the dial, the temperature dial, that's from Europe. And so I'm bringing in the idea of the environment, the toxic rain, the natural world, and then again, the temperature control. And it's all integrated in this continuous kind of skin. Here, I'm just really experimenting with whether I could capture the sense of like the fish skin itself in this flat, moving, undulating thing, not painting an actual fish. So it's changing the form of the fish into this flat object-like surface, and just to be able to make it so that the dots are not dots on the surface, but really feel like you would in a natural animal skin. And here I took photographs of the fish, and because I could do this with the pastel, that's what enabled me to do that. I'm saying that only because later on when we're going to see my digital work, the digital allowed me to do that just effortlessly. And that was an amazing confluence of the technology and what I was trying to do in this more traditional way. Well, not so, with the silk screen, which was still now considered very traditional. Hard time controlling this thing. Okay, so here I'm introducing now the screen itself into the screen image. So this is now, it's kind of another step. There really wasn't I can't remember really the dates and when our evolution with the computer and our screens, but I don't think we yet had the screen within the screen. And I was very surprised when that is actually what started to happen with computer desktop screens. This really was more that we have this organic form, and then within the organic form we have screens. And so who's looking at who again? And the screen is the inside of this organic form. So it's getting to the point now, at this point, where I realized I could not articulate what I was trying to get at anymore. It was just a sense of what was happening. And that's why I was doing the work. And I couldn't explain really in a narrative way what this is, but I could feel that this was the dimension I was feeling was going on here. Okay, so then the next body of work was around 2000, and I heard that they were introducing a software that could do imaging, which was, at the time, Photoshop. And so I remember just vaguely hearing about it and thought, well, this is on the computer. I'm not a computer person. I can't do it. Must be a lot of programming or everything. And then I realized that, no, this was making very user-friendly. You can just put on your photographs and start manipulating. So I took a year off. I was teaching at the time just to learn Photoshop, because I found that if I did it on the weekends, I couldn't remember what I did the week before, because it was so intensive to remember how to do it. You had to do it every day. It was, for me, like training in a sport. And then it gets to be kind of automatic. So my experience, and the college gave me a sabbatical just to do it. I did it for a whole year. And by the end of the year, the mouse felt totally automatic. It felt like a pencil. And then I said, I could work with this now as a medium. And at the same time, I was working with that book, Photoshop for Dummies, and I felt I needed to get to the point where it is really like Photoshop for Dummies for me to be able to work with it. If it got any more complicated, then the complexity would overtake the creative process. So this work was the first body of work of just my experiment that year. So this is a close-up from the panel, the double panel you just saw. And what I did here was, this was taken from a Lego board. And I was surrounded by Lego because I was raising my son. And I thought Lego was amazing to begin with, because it was doing everything I wanted to do. You could just take heads and put it into the box, and it was all modular, and you had all these bodies, and it was techie. So I took the Lego board and put in a sculptural medium for casting, and then tried to fill it to make the cast, but it wouldn't fill exactly. So it made these kind of very organic shapes. It's like not a good cast. And so then I photographed that and put it into Photoshop and then began to manipulate that. And I didn't really know what it was. It's just, this is kind of coming out of this process. And then I took photographs that you can see I've been working with in the silkscreen and fused that. The Photoshop enabled me to connect and fuse and to integrate just seamlessly. And it was just astonishing to me that this just emerged. And even the tools was called cloning, and allowed me to photograph skin. And then this piece, once I took the photographs of the cast, urethane at the time, I then cloned this image of the skin all around each one of these bumps. So this literally is coming out of skin. And then, this is like 8 by 8 feet. I didn't do the full 8 feet because of the power of the Photoshop. I could just do a small module and then just multiply it, and then it grew very quickly, which is interesting because it's kind of like a biological process. So this kind of gradual integration of the process of biology with technology was happening actually in the work. I was totally unaware of the congruence of it as I was doing it. I can only say that now in retrospect. So here I'm just, experimenting with that. This is just little studies in the Lego, and I considered doing a body of work around Lego, but it's not body enough, and that's why I didn't pursue it further. I still have an interest in going there, but you can see the sense of what it is. Okay, now I'm going to jump to, this is a recent show in MAMCO. And whenever people came to the studio and they saw this work with the Photoshop, they just didn't say anything. They just didn't even talk about it. And I remember when I had to show it I did a very small show for my tenure review. And I remember it was a small opening. A few people came, and one guy just said, "Just get me out of this room." And I always remember that. And I actually thought that was an interesting reaction. And in MAMCO, and just recently in Geneva, they supported showing the whole body of work, which I was amazed. So I began doing these wall works. When I started working with Photoshop, I could see, because we were already talking about in the art world, the cost of shipping was getting prohibitive. That's just the beginning when we were working between Cologne and New York. It was not like today. And so I was thinking, this is amazing. I can do this on the file, even though I'm printing the work, but actually the work is the file itself. So how do you deal with that? So then I realized that then we don't need to send the whole thing stretched. I can just send the file, and this is obvious now to everybody, and then we print there, and there's no shipping costs. There's no carbon footprint. So that was always in my mind, but I needed the support of something where this could actually happen. And that didn't happen until around 2018, when the SculptureCenter and Hammer wanted to do the work. And so we did these large walls with this concept, and now it's interesting now when a curator comes to see the work and talk about a show, and they say, well, what about this and the shipping and what's closer to my city and what's further from my city? I say, well, I have this one work where there's no shipping cost at all. And so I explain it, and they say, oh, let's do that work. And so I now have titled it, it's actually managed to grow from what was in SculptureCenter. It was Interface New York, and now it's Interface Gwangju, Interface Geneva, Interface Secession. So the titles now are almost a conceptual piece of what the real idea was, where it's really not about the object. It's not even about the print, because the print is customized to the site. It's really about this virtual digital file, but that it can grow anywhere. It can go anywhere, and that to me is paradigmatic of this virtual world, of this, it's not even the virtual world, it's the world we live in. It's this fluid sense of motion and contingency. So again, even though it's sort of captured with the titles in Secession, it's still how can you actually image this? What's going on right now? So for me, it's still, there's still a sense of struggle of trying to visualize all of this. And the world gets more complex. This whole thing keeps growing and gets more difficult to even understand what I'm trying to visualize. And AI throws a whole nother monkey wrench into the thing. So, but you can see, it keeps me motivated. Okay, where are we on the time here? So I think that's about it right now. I did one small project. This was a piece, I did a project where I worked in Shanghai. This is when China was very open. It was very easy to go and work there. I actually had family members there. And the Chinese contemporary art world was really growing, and I was interested to see what it was like. So I did this project around, so I decided not to just go there and take what I do in New York and just try to do that there. So I'm just gonna really just start from scratch. And I thought I would kind of just go in the streets and just, collect things or whatever. Well then, due to, the family, my mother passed away, and the family started exchanging pictures in this kind of a diaspora. And I went there, and there was these albums that had a lot of old family photos, and I said, this is what the whole project is going to be about. And so I was still interested in experimenting with the digital and the photography. And at the time, the level of quality of advertising in Shanghai at the time was just mind-blowing. They had it on the subways, but it was just like so eye-popping. I was curious how they did it. And I just happened to meet this guy, he was from Russia, who was working there, and he did those billboards. And he explained to me, the technique for how they do that. And so the project was this integration of this very personal history, which I was aware was just kind of a tangent to everything I did. And I'm trying to infuse that with this silkscreen and silicone, which is what I was working in now. This is on aluminum. So at the end of the project, it turned out that, I'm trying to make a long story short, that the work still really was about technology and the body, but it was in a very personal sense of my own personal history, which is about my body, coming through the technology, because I could not have done this work without the internet, where we were sending photos from all around the world, and then I was able to produce this technologically to get the quality that I did working in Photoshop. So I thought it was interesting that in a very personal way, it was still about the same quality. So this is just a close-up. I'll just give you one shot here of the work then. The irony was that when I went there, there was this I was working with this stainless steel wire mesh on silicone, because silicone won't bond to anything but itself. And then everything had to be gray because of the stainless steel wire mesh. But working in Shanghai, because of the climate, everything, most of the days were kind of gray. So it just worked, the two together. So whenever I think of the work, it really reminds me of the experience of working there. This is a close-up now of the silicone on the stainless steel. And you can see I'm still working with it in a very painterly way, and that really still influences kind of how I work with things. Okay, so I didn't, so there's one other thing. Where are we on the time? E? Are we okay? I don't know. I'll just show you one more thing. The recent work that's up now on the High Line in New York. And now that you have some sense of the evolution, so these, I'm now using the digital and wrapping these large sculptural forms. The images here I'm using are produced in AI. And for me, AI is a continuous to what I've always been doing in a way. I don't feel apologetic about saying I use AI. To me, it's just an extension of what has been going on for a long time. It's more radical and more dangerous, for sure. But it happens to be doing things now with the forms and images of the body in a way that I would never have been able to do before, and it's changing the nature of the work. And I guess to talk about this, in a way now, it's more graphically the body, but then it's not the body at all. So in that sense, it's the kind of decentering of the human into, perhaps we have to be human in a very different way, in the way we're getting distributed in the world. I think that's kind of what this work is beginning to point to. Okay, I think we're sort of running out of time here. Are there any questions?
Oh, this is just a really quick one, but I'm thinking about the transition from the works that sit more on the wall and then the more recent pieces that are sculptural. And most of the wall works were like wall size, like larger than a human body. And these are, I don't know what size they are. I guess I'm trying to figure out like how big these sculptures are relative to the viewer's body.
These are the size of an automobile. This is like about 20 feet long. I'm trying to get this PowerPoint. Do you want me to talk about scale or just, yeah, okay.
I hope you answer the question. I'm not stopping. So one question and one comment. Especially starting with the silk screen period of time, it's just there's such a sense of coding and a language happening while you're repeating certain phrases through imagery. I was just wondering if you have ever thought about that, or if the work connecting to coding through that way. One comment would be, it's so funny to hear you talking about that's the American nostalgia showed up in your works through that particular way. But when you come to China to making work, it's becoming so out of character. Maybe that's like a culture difference showed up in your work. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I didn't get the question. So,
The question's talking about, is there any reference to coding?
yeah.
Through-
So there was no reference to coding at all. I mean, it may be there in the work, but I was not thinking of coding at all. I'm in some sense more experiential. It's kind of what this is doing to me. In that sense, it's, I think, coming more from my body in terms of what I do and how I do it. I know there's a whole area of contemporary art in which there are coders. And there was a whole discussion, maybe still going on. You know, the people who created Photoshop are the real artists. So I understand there's a whole, you know, very rigorous intellectual discussion about that. And a lot of the stuff with the NFTs and these really good coders who are creating work now. And I know I have had some students who do amazing work, and they're brilliant coders. So, but that's not what I was thinking about at all. Yeah. In some ways, I may be more traditional in that sense.
Your depiction of the human body has almost been post-human through your entire practice. Can you speak to the omission of typical markers of the bodily discourse, like sexuality or gender?
Well, if in the recent work, people have always said my work is very sexual. This is a very complex question. I think that, and I'm speaking now from what the work is telling me, that just like everything else is kind of blurring and coming together in a way, being integrated, the things like gender, sexual orientation are similar kind of ambiguity and blending and less defined by particular attributes is what the work is suggesting. And it's a continuous, fluid experience. I don't know the literature, and there are really brilliant people writing about all of this right now, and the idea of the post-human. In fact, I'm reading one right now. So I don't want my work to specifically address gender and sexuality in the way we know of it now, in this very political way, because I think that is not, that's just not what I've been focusing on. To do that kind of work is a very different kind of work, and I think we see a lot of it, and I think that's great. I mean, I do what I do just because that's, as I said in the beginning, that's what gets me up in the morning. Similarly about race, I'm a racial other, and I've had a lot of discussions with, you know, Asian American literature faculty and the whole trajectory of Asian American consciousness in American culture and literature. And what it was surprising me, because I always was conflicted because I'm not doing specifically Asian American work, whatever that means. But in some sense, my position is kind of where it's going now, because it's very hard to have this essentialism. Well, so what is Asian American? There's so many, it's so diverse. You can't pin it down anymore. So on the other hand, I chose to do something that was the other to the whole culture, to our species. And so maybe in some level you want to psychoanalyze why I do what I do. I mean, maybe, you know, I related to that otherness of technology itself because perhaps I'm an other also, I don't know. And you can see I did that one tangent of the work from my family history, and that was interesting, and I would like to do one more show of that. But it's not, it could not be the central focus of my work. It wouldn't sustain me. I felt more compelled to talk about this idea of the embodied technology than anything, and that's just the way I was, that's it. I can say that I think how am I going to put this? The work that I did in Shanghai, what they call the Delete Show, I realized at the end of the period I spent there, I think it was about a year, about 2 years, in short periods back and forth. I did this while I was teaching. That the work really wasn't about my experience. It was really about absence. It was about what I didn't experience myself. I grew up in the U.S. I never even, knew China. I never went there until late, my mature adulthood. So what I realized was really about the absence of that in my consciousness and whether I could really express that, which would be very challenging, but is something I would really like to try. And I've had curators who've supported just doing the whole project and they would show it. And I said, I can't commit to it without seeing what it's going to be like. It may not work. But so that's still very much in the back of my mind. And whether the evolution of the work now, like this, with the digital, might enable me to do it in some way, that I couldn't do it before. And maybe it has to do with the sense of a different way of depicting the body in the world. This continuous surface that's very fluid and ambiguous may be able to capture something that I couldn't in a typical figurative painting or a collage, let's say, with photographs. I don't know whether that answered your question.
So thank you so much, Tishan, for this wonderful talk, and thank you, everyone, for coming.